Without objection.
Tomorrow, the Senate's going to vote on whether to protect free and fair elections in America. And the big question we have to ask in the United States Senate is whether the right to vote and free and fair elections are worth any of our time. You see, the first vote we have here is on what's known as a motion to proceed. It's a basic question to the Senate. You want to talk about something? Is it important enough for your time? You want to bring it up here and say a few words about the right to vote in America? That's the first vote. I think it's pretty simple. Why wouldn't we, at this moment in history, with everything that's going on, spend some time talking about the right to vote? Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, says, no, we shouldn't take any time to discuss the right to vote in the United States of America. He and many of our Republican colleagues are threatening to use the age-old weapon against civil rights, the filibuster, to stop even a conversation on the floor of the United States Senate about the right to vote. That would make the third time this year that Senate Republicans have used the filibuster to kill voting rights legislation. They filibustered the For the People Act twice this year after it passed the House. They said then that they support voting rights, but not that voting rights bill. They said more compromise was needed. Well, you can't reach compromise on anything until you talk about it. And we're going to have a motion to proceed to talk about voting rights on the floor of the Senate tomorrow. So if they want to offer a compromise, if they want to get into a conversation or a debate, that's the moment. This empty chamber, I wonder sometimes why we leave it the way it is. This would be a great meeting hall. We could rent it out for wedding receptions and have something productive happen on the floor of the United States Senate. But instead, this empty chamber, day after day, finds ways to avoid the important issues of our time. That's sad. There are very few of us who've been given this great honor and opportunity to serve in the Senate. We're supposed to come and talk about the things that matter in America. Isn't the right to vote one of the most important things that matters in this country? The Freedom to Vote Act is a compromise itself. It's based on a set of principles offered by Senator Manchin of West Virginia. Now, Senator Manchin's not concealed the fact that he didn't agree with the original bill, but in fairness to him, he sat down in good faith and bargained a compromise bill. He's worked exhaustively for months with Democrats, Republicans, and independents to find some common ground. I salute him for that. That's what we all should be doing. The Freedom to Vote Act includes reasonable national standards for a voter ID. Now, that's a big concession from the Democratic side because although many of our states have a voter ID, many do not. And we believe in some cases in the past it's been abused. But the fundamental concept of a voter ID, I don't have any objection to, as long as it's managed and administered fairly, and that's what we're setting out to do. So if our Republican colleagues are really worried about election integrity and making sure voters are who they say they are, wouldn't you think that they would at least vote to start the debate on the Freedom to Vote Act? That we would have a conversation in this empty chamber that might even attract a handful of senators on both sides of the aisle to talk about the right to vote in America in the year 2021 and beyond. That just seems so basic. Well, what the Republicans say is the Freedom to Vote Act is much more than just a debate topic. It is a federal takeover of our elections. That simply is not the case. The Freedom to Vote Act does not create any undue burden on any state. Instead, it sets reasonable minimum standards for voting access in all states, including automatic and same-day voter registration, 2 weeks of early voting, no excuse mail-in voting. It establishes Election Day as a federal holiday. All of these proposals are consistent with the clear language of the Constitution. It will protect nonpartisan election officials from undue pressure and prevent politicians from overturning elections if they don't like the voters' choices. The Freedom to Vote Act also makes it harder for billionaires and powerful corporations to buy elections. Let's be real honest. Members of Congress and others run for office, set out to raise money. But the important fundraising is taking place in a mystery, in a secret, with black money and dark money that comes into an election with no indication of its source. It's going to prevent the flow of foreign money into U.S. elections. Is there anybody who wants to argue for the premise that we should allow foreigners to invest in our election results or to try to influence the electorate, sometimes with misinformation and outright lies? I don't think they have any business interfering in our election. I think most Americans agree with it. That's what the Freedom to Vote Act says. In addition to that, dark money needs to get out of politics. If you want to stand up and support a candidate, so be it. But for goodness sakes, say who you are. Identify yourself. Let the American people know who's pushing one candidate or the other. Organizations engaged in political spending will be required to tell the public who's giving them how much money. That's pretty simple, pretty obvious. There was a time when that level of disclosure was supported by the Republican minority leader in the Senate. I remember his speeches well on the floor of the Senate. He shifted 180 degrees on the topic now. Last fall, 2020, Americans braved a pandemic to vote in record numbers. Exhaustive legal challenges and recounts seeking to validate the outrageous lie of election fraud went nowhere. Former President Trump went to 50 or 60 different courts to argue that Joe Biden didn't win the election. He couldn't produce a shred of evidence. All he had were the ramblings and gossip and fake news, if you will, on the internet. It didn't work. Rudy Giuliani came up with some harebrained schemes on behalf of President Trump. Italy-gate, that somehow the Italians had satellites that controlled America's voting machinery. Ridiculous things. When that didn't work, the former president decided he would just take over the Department of Justice. Our committee, the Judiciary Committee, which we serve on, Mr. President, went into extensive investigation of that and came up with detailed information which we released to the public 2 weeks ago. And the Republicans were in on all of our investigation. They were invited to question the witnesses, to be present, to even see our majority report in advance. We wanted to make this bipartisan and fair, and we did. And what they came up with was the president's failed attempt to take over the Department of Justice, to force them to go to the states and say, don't validate the 2020 election. A few people stood up and showed courage in the Department of Justice and said they were prepared to resign before they bent to the President Trump's pressure. And that was a fact. That's what we face with now. This former president still marketing his lies across America about the outcome of the 2020 election. And we will not even take the time to discuss elections and voting. The Republicans will stop us with a filibuster. Many politicians in many states continue to use the big lie of a stolen election to try to make it harder for citizens to vote in future elections. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, 19 states have passed 33 bills this year, making it harder for citizens to vote. Hundreds of similar bills have been proposed in 49 states. These proposals and laws are a dagger at the heart of democracy's leadership in this effort. He has really worked hard at it, trying to bring this matter before the American people on the floor. We've also been engaged in a similar process on an equally critical piece of legislation, John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Mr. President, I've been here long enough to remember a time when the Voting Rights Act came before the United States Senate and got 98 votes. Virtually all the Democrats, all the Republicans voted for it. No controversy. They believed that this product of the 1960s civil rights debate was fair. It said that in certain states with a proven history of discrimination against minority voters, when they proposed changes in election laws, we would examine them, pre-clear them, as they say. The Supreme Court tossed out that section, and we have tried to restore it. I think the Supreme Court was wrong, and maybe even naive in believing that voter discrimination could not take place in the future. For example, when there was a contest over district maps in the state of North Carolina, and it was taken to a federal court, the federal judge said, and I paraphrase, they worked with surgical precision to discriminate against African American voters in these maps. That's the kind of conduct which can't be tolerated in any state, red or blue. The Freedom to Vote Act is the first of two crucial steps we're going to take to protect what our late friend and colleague John Lewis called a, quote, precious, almost sacred right. And I hope that we also take similar action on the Voting Rights Act next week. Like both of these bills, the Voting Rights Act extension that Ronald Reagan signed in 1982 was a result of a compromise. The final bill, when President Reagan signed it and said, prove that differences can be settled in goodwill and good faith, wouldn't it be refreshing to have that happen again on the floor of this, the empty floor of this Senate tomorrow? That's all we're asking of our Republican colleagues. Don't use the filibuster, the weapon of Jim Crow, to abet the assault on voting rights. Offer amendments if you like, but work with us in goodwill and good faith to protect the voting rights which so many have sacrificed for. Mr. President, I ask briefly to be allowed to speak at a separate place in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republican minority leader came to the floor a few minutes ago and once again spoke about inflation. And of course we're concerned about it, and we're watching it closely. We're in an unusual period in our nation's economy. We're recovering from the pandemic, and the economy is getting back on its feet. And yes, there are problems. We see supply chain problems addressed by President Biden just this week. We know things that are stacked up trying to get in the United States. That was possibly unavoidable in the midst of a pandemic when consumer demand cratered, and now it's recovering, and our demand outstrips the supplies that are flowing into our country. But I also want to remind the Republican leader from Kentucky that his opposition to extending the debt ceiling, unfortunately, is also a problem when it comes to inflation. If there is uncertainty as to whether this nation will pay its just debts, obviously that'll be reflected in the financial markets and higher interest rates. Higher interest rates feed inflation. So the strategy of Senator McConnell when it comes to the debt ceiling is pro-inflationary itself. Also, he talks about the socialist spending spree of the reconciliation bill, Build Back Better. And he says in critical terms that the Democrats argue that the cost of this will be, quote, $0, close quote. He says what they don't say, what Democrats don't say, is they have to impose massive tax hikes for this to happen. Well, I might say to the senator from Kentucky, we have been very open about what our tax policy would be to pay for Build Back Better. That policy would say to those making over $400,000 a year in income that they would have to pay higher taxes. Yes, we've said it. Those people would have to pay higher taxes. And corporations, which are escaping their just tax liability, would now have to pay their fair share too. Certainly in those two instances, we are raising taxes. But the taxes don't touch the working people of this country or those in lower income categories, nor should they. He also says that we have a war, these are his words, a war on affordable energy. I want to just reflect on the word affordable energy. It is true that we have ample energy resources in most places in America. But to argue that they are affordable is to fail to take into account what the cost of climate change is in America and around the world. It is not affordable for us to have so many greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels that we are creating extreme weather events all across the world. And we've seen them here in the United States. We've seen the fires in your state of California and in the Northwest. We have seen the flooding all across the country, including the Midwest. We have seen violent weather occurring at times of the year when historically it never occurs. And we are paying a heavy price for climate change, global warming, and the fact that we are so dependent on fossil fuels. So when the Democrats, and it used to be another bipartisan issue, it no longer is, but when the Democrats sound the alarm about climate change and global warming, it is because current energy sources are not affordable in terms of the future of our planet. We have to find a better way. I'm sorry to see so many current politicians unable or unwilling to accept their responsibility to change this country and the world for the better, and to leave an earth, a planet, an environment that our kids can live in. I don't think that's too much to ask, and I think we ought to do our part. The last thing Senator McConnell went into this morning was giving new powers to the IRS to snoop. Well, I guess that's true in some respects. We believe that people who owe taxes ought to pay them. And the vast majority of American families are honest, want to do their civic duty. They file their taxes on time and try to pay every penny they're supposed to. Not more, but every penny they're supposed to. And yet there are many who are hiding their assets, and hiding their profits, and hiding their revenues, and hiding their income from the IRS and not paying the taxes that they owe. Yes, they should be audited. Yes, they should be held accountable. Why should the average American family be held to a higher standard of honesty than the richest people in this country? I think it's only fair that everyone be held to the same standard. Finally, I want to say this memorandum by Attorney General Merrick Garland that Senator McConnell referred to earlier. He suggested that we are going after parents, that we want to somehow harass, intimidate, and arrest parents who are appearing before school boards. I went back to read this memorandum. It's very explicit. Those who engage in violent conduct at school board meetings are going to be stopped. They are violating the law, and they are violating the spirit of those meetings where communities come together and decide the fate and future of public education. I think the Attorney General is right. We should have safety in that environment just as we demand it here on the floor of the United States Senate. Nothing more and nothing less. Mr. President, I yield the floor.